Chapter 11. Luli. The first thing Luli saw when she entered the Dewan was nothing. The darkness was so complete it swallowed even the swaths of moonlight that ought to have illuminated the chamber. She was seized by the sudden urge to flee, even if it meant rushing back into the arms of her captors. She wasn't a hero. She was simply a merchant with a knife and a glowing orb. What chance did she stand against a djinn who wielded shadows as a weapon? But the door slammed shut before she could retreat. She had just a few moments to panic before some invisible weight pushed her down on her shoulders and forced her to the ground. Then her panic gave way to desperation, and she reacted on instinct, pressing her hands to the orb until it was bright enough to bring the light to the invisible force. She saw shadows, strange, limb-like things that withdrew with a shriek when the light touched them. She stumbled to her feet as they shrank back, revealing the room that had been hidden moments before. Men and women squinted against the light and stared at her as if in a trance. The closer she drew to them, the more aware of their surroundings they seemed to become, until their eyes lit up with fear. "Look out!" a man cried, and Luli barely managed to turn in time to face a shadow shooting toward her. The moment it reached the light, it shivered and retreated. All around her the darkness rippled and whispered. When she turned towards the man who had warned her, she saw nothing. The darkness had again engulfed everything and everyone. "Jinn!" The Luli held the orb up. The darkness barely pulled back. "Where are you, Jinn?" A laugh echoed behind her. A man's laugh. "You did not learn your lesson the first time, human girl." He stepped into the darkness. Though Luli had never seen him in person, she knew immediately that it had to be Prince Mazin, for he was dressed in fine, rich clothing. He shifted on his feet, and the shadows beneath him slowly stretched toward her, bleeding into the light. She stepped back, once, twice, until she was walking backward, trying to put as much distance between herself and the possessed prince as possible. "Have you come again to convince me?" The prince held out his hands, and the shadows surged forward, nipping at her heels. "You have no power here." She took another step back, another, and another, until she felt a cold press of the wall against her back. Prince Mazin drew close enough for her to make out his features. She saw his eyes, and stopped. She knew those eyes. The last time she'd seen them, they had been filled with innocent wonder. "Yusuf?" The prince stopped in front of her. She thought she saw something pass over his face, fear or regret, before he smiled and said, "Yusuf no more." "He's not the one you want," Luli said with forced calm. Her hand was shaking, and it made the light quiver on the walls. "I told you before, he's not a hunter." "No," the djinn wearing the prince's skin said. "He is not. He is in fact inconsequential." Inconsequential. The word was a strike of flint against her dark memories. Luli remembered her father, starry-eyed and full of laughter. Her mother, with her sly smiles and warm hugs. She remembered a knife against her throat, a man with a serpentine smile. "You are all inconsequential," he had said. Luli breathed out softly. She forced herself to look into the prince's eyes. No life is inconsequential. She didn't know whom she was speaking to anymore. She only hoped that whoever it was would see the truth in her words. "Oh," the prince said dryly. A strange thing happened then. The darkness in the room abated, giving way to dusky gray. Luli heard the shouts of an audience that had moments ago been trapped in the dark. She saw the prince quiver like a leaf in the wind, then collapse to his knees with a gasp. His shadow rose up from the ground. It sharpened itself into a blade. The world suddenly seemed too fast, and she too slow. She cried out a warning, but the prince's movements were sluggish. He looked up. Recognition flashed through his eyes, and then the shadow stabbed him through the chest, and his eyes went wide with pain. He collapsed silently to the ground as the shadow pulled back. Crimson pooled on the floor beneath him, and it seemed to Luli that it was the only color in the room. "I told you," the djinn's voice was everywhere and nowhere. "He is inconsequential." Luli could feel the djinn watching her from the shadows, but she could not stop staring at the prince, willing him to move. He did not. Luli heard screaming, but the sound seemed to come from a great distance. She did not realize the source of it until the sultan rushed to his son's side and collapsed to his knees. He yelled Mazen's name as he took the limp body into his arms. Luli could only stare on numbly. Is this my fault? The Jinn lunged at her from the shadows as an angry stream of smoke. She filled Luli's sight, appearing before her as a crimson-eyed wraith. Luli swept the blade through the smoky shape, but her knife hissed through empty air. You are too soft-hearted for your own good, the Jinn said softly. How will you seek revenge on the assassins in black with such a fragile heart? Luli swung the blade wildly through the air. With every motion, she became aware of the familiar burning sensation in her lungs. She did not care. She kept slicing and screaming until her body was shaking with fatigue. Memories of blood and stars and corpses flashed behind her eyes. I am not fragile, she thought. I am not fragile. I am not fragile. But the shadows were persistent. They grabbed her arms and legs and threw her to the ground. There was a loud crack, and the light from the orb blinked and died. The room went into a nightmare pitch black. Luli scratched at the ground, grasped her knife with numb fingers. She wouldn't die here. She refused to die here. Get up. A deep voice, familiar as her own heartbeat, thudded through her mind. Luli gasped and opened her eyes. She saw Kadir's knife laying beside her, blazing with blue fire. Red eyes blinked at her from the blade's surface. I found you, Kadir said. The flames on the blade snapped gently at her fingers, urging her into action. Luli drew slowly to her feet. She spared a glance at the orb which lay shattered on the floor, then faced the Jinn, who stared at her with wide eyes. Impossible, the Jinn stepped back. That blade! How did you get that blade? Move, Kadir said, as though he was not in the room with her. His magic, his presence, gave her the confidence to act. Luli tore at the darkness until she cleared a path, and then she fell on the shadow Jinn with her blade. The Jinn caught her strike against a wall of solidified shadow. Luli gritted her teeth against the shock of the impact. She tightened her grip on the knife and threw her weight into the stab. The fire coating the blade's edge flared, and the obstacle peeled away like burning parchment. But the Jinn had already fled. Behind you, Kadir snapped. Luli whirled just in time to catch the edge of a razor-sharp darkness against her knife. The Jinn's glowing eyes flashed with surprise. It was enough of an opening for Luli to change her deflection into a parry and throw her opponent off balance. The Jinn withdrew, breathing heavily. She wasn't a warrior, Luli realized. She was a puppeteer trying to command wild magic. Good, the fire on her blade cackled as if with amusement. That makes two of us. They fought, fire against shadows, dark barriers against flaming dagger, until the flaming knife charred away the Jinn's magic bit by bit, and the room's color returned. The shadow Jinn fell back, her body flickering in and out like a dying flame. But though she was fading, Luli could tell she was not wounded. The fire could make her disappear, but it could not kill her. The Jinn, reduced to nothing but a faint shape in the moonlight, began to disappear into the walls. It was exactly like what happened in the place of worship. Luli hesitated. The blade grew warm in her hands, but before she could decide whether to pursue, she was distracted by a wink of silver in the dark. A sharp, glimmering object that shot past her head and caught the Jinn in the chest. She released an agonizing, blood-curdling scream that made the air tremble. Luli spun to search for the attacker. She froze when she saw Omar bin Malik striding out of the gloom. He flashed a smile as he brushed past her toward the vanishing Jinn, who had solidified into a beautiful woman with rivers of darkness streaming down her back. Blood dripped down her lips as she coughed. You, she gasped when Omar pulled out the knife. Impossible, the Jinn staggered away. You, I killed you. Omar's grin was a feral flash of teeth. You, kill the king of 40 thieves? What a conceited notion. Luli glanced at him. At the strange black knife he made her tangible, but how? The shadow Jinn attempted to flee, but she was too slow. Omar stabbed her, again and again and again, until her screams faded and died. Lily turned away and closed her eyes. She knew, even without looking, that the Jinn's body would crumble to dust, and her blood would seep into the tiles and coax nature into being where there had been none before. Get out. Her eyes shut open at the Sultan's commands. All of you, get out. Both guests and guards fled the room, stumbling toward the doors as if they'd just woken from a dream. Luli remained. Now that everyone had left, she could see the Sultan again. He and a young man with hazel eyes leaned over the bloodied Prince Mazin. The fire in her blood disappeared as she ventured to step forward. Omar. The Sultan didn't even see her. What are you doing, boy? The blood! Prince Omar turned stiffly toward the dead Jinn. Luli watched as he sliced off one of his sleeves and soaked it in Jinn blood. Understanding flared within her as he crouched beside Prince Mazin and squeezed the fabric over his brother's fatal wound. The Prince Mazin began to struggle. The Sultan and the hazel-eyed man held him down. This process was repeated until the prince's wound was sealed and he lay limp on the floor, unconscious but not dead. The elixir of revival, the masses called it. The miracle of Jinn blood, Luli thought. Her stomach twisted with revulsion and relief. The Sultan pressed his forehead to his son's. The hazel-eyed man, Hakim, the bastard prince, Luli realized, clasped his shaking hands together in prayer. But Omar was not looking at Mazin or the rest of his family. He was looking at her. He never looked away, not even when he called the Cade to remove her from the room. Outside, she reflected that it was not his gaze that had been disarming, but the anger darkening in his eyes.